all right. Welcome. This is Theological Discussion, and I am your host, RC Apologist. And we are here tuning in for another episode of Theological Discussion, this time with mainly going to be focused on one topic. Why? Because we actually have, and are testing out the first time with as well as another person, the format of getting multiple guests on. So we're going to be doing this. We're going to be making sure that we have a good conversation that can go up with this. And if, by the way, those of you who are watching and tuning in, feel free to hit that like button, and also feel free to share this link out so that way some of y'all can then get involved into the discussion in the chat. Because as this whole point of the show is engaged in, this is theological discussion. That's what we're hoping to engage in, is to get a discussion involved, to get a discussion out there. But speaking of discussion, you can't have discussions without your, people to discuss. Otherwise, you're just ranting in a monologue, or in my particular case, you look into the mirror and start ranting and raving to yourself like you're the next Joker, Joaquin Phoenix. Eat your heart out, please. Okay, that being said, let's get straight into this here. We got Abe, our usual corn host, your co-host. What the heck is coming out of my mouth right now? I was trying to say candy corn, and then corn host came out. I don't know how that happened. So your candy corn doggo, your co-host, Avera, or Ave, as I call him. Good to have you back as usual, my good old co-host.
Yes, that was funny. Hello, everyone. This is me, Avera Nova, the candy corn doggo. You can call me Ave for short. It's all good. Very well. I'm looking forward to an amazing episode as per the usual.
And it's going to be a per usual big episode, because today we're going to have on a special guest. Some of y'all who are familiar with the circles may know him, but if you're not familiar with our circles or with the debate world, let me just remind y'all of who we are dealing with. Today we are having on board someone who is of no stranger to controversy. He is also a very big and out there kind of individual. He has debated the likes of Richard Carrier and Robert Price, and is even did a de facto debate, I believe is what the terminology is used, though I don't necessarily know what that means. That's probably just because I'm an idiot who doesn't know certain phrases and words, blah 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 blah. We have he did a de facto debate with Bart Ehrman himself. Now then, we have with us the person who's the mastermind behind these particular debates, as well as the videos that, in my opinion, have caused up a great stir of controversy that need to honestly be addressed. And we have here with us the man himself, Jonathan Sheffield. I think that's how you pronounce that last name. Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you so much, RC Apologist and Avira, for having me on. Always been a fan of your work, your show, and all the great things in the evangelical community that you're doing. So definitely God bless for all the work that you've been doing.
Well, thank you. Appreciate that. Now, I want to two things be noted here as we begin. Number one, if you notice why if I speak too fast or if I get too hyped up, just letting y'all know, I drank a can of Bang before we started. It's Star Blast flavor, which this flavor tastes like them Star Pops, ice pops, where it's got like 3 different flavors on each of the colors that they have. That's essentially what this is. It's just like a soda pop version of it in an energy drink.
Well, last time you were drinking tea to soothe your voice.
I know, right? I went from soothing herbal tea with no caffeine, and then I got Bang, and Lord knows what kind of... At least it's not Bang stoked, because I've just discovered that yesterday, and that's Bang with CBD in it.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah, they even have like the marijuana leaf on the O in the stoked.
Of course they do.
I'm like, so it's the kind of person that wants to be like mellow, but also have that energy. It's like you can't decide what you want, so there you go. We'll just put it right there as a combination for everybody.
All right.
But that's the first thing. Now, second thing to keep in mind is that we're going over a set of videos that y'all can check on his channel. I linked everything in the description. I gave the link to his channel. So if anyone wants to go check out the videos, check out his content, feel free to do so. But here's where my issue is. Because here's the thing. Me and Jonathan have had conversations before. We seem to be friendly. But there has been one thing that has always irked me about the videos in the past. And I thought there was some kind of differences on it. But then it comes back again when the release of the Halloween video came about. And that was that the Halloween video going against the New Testament textual criticism methodology, and then including Daniel Wallace and James White but mostly James White being people that's being against it, or people that Sheffield seems to have a thing against in the video, especially James White, who in the video is depicted as going through a journey with Stewie from Family Guy, which that's the one thing I have to give Sheffield the credit for, is that he manages to find some way to make the most ridiculous sounding concepts manage to work for an educational video on something. So which leads me to ask this question: how do you come up with some of these ideas for that? Because I remember for the Richard Carrier one, you did like Raiders of the Lost Ark and everything.
Yeah, I think the concept I was originally playing on, and what I like about having like Raiders of the Last Raiders of the Last, I have a theme that I can fill in a script narrative to that would kind of help bring some familiarity to the audience and kind of help guide the animation. With this one, I wanted a Halloween theme, and I thought a Back to the Future element, because we're going to need to go back in time and really discuss some historical periods which fit in. But as you can see, I go back to my Halloween theme, kind of portraying the Bible industry itself. That's why I kind of have Nestle Allen, which is sort of the headquarters for one of the biggest Bible publishing companies out of Germany, kind of depicted with also Dr. Peter Gurry, who's one of the sort of New Testament, up-and-coming New Testament textual scholars working on the new coherence-based genealogical method, which is the sort of textual analysis tools that they're using with computers to sort of decipher and restore the original text of the New Testament. So the UBS, or United Bible Society, and Allen, which are the two major Bible publishing industries, are now utilizing these new textual methods that are going to be the basis for all future Bible translations and editions.
I see. And as a candy corn doggo, who is the symbol of Halloween itself, I definitely do appreciate your theme and approach to this matter. But can you simplify exactly what it is your argument is against this, or what it has to do with Scripture specifically?
Okay, and perfect. I think that's the most important thing to really. What are my arguments against not only Dan Wallace, James White, but this particular school of thought itself?
Right.
And this is what, even though Daniel Wallace and James White are depicted, along with Peter Gurry and Tommy Wasserman, who represent some of the top in the field, it's really portraying the current worldview that is promoted by these Bible production industries. So to help narrow down and simplify the argument that I'm going against, I want to bring up Bruce Metzger. Now, he was an American Bible scholar. He's a Bible translator and textual critic who's a longtime professor at Princeton Theological Society or Seminary. And he also served on the board of the American Bible Society and the UBS, so one of the big production companies for Bibles. Now, interesting enough, Bruce Metzger, who's had a great deal of influence in this field of textual criticism, was also the teacher and advisor to Bart Ehrman. So when Bart Ehrman was going to school at Princeton, Bruce Metzger was his advisor when he was a Christian, going through his PhD. So it's kind of interesting these two come together. Now, Bruce Metzger, one of his first major works that he produced was called The Text of the New Testament. And it's titled Its Transmission, Corruption, and Restoration.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I want us to focus real quick on the word corruption, because when we're speaking of the text of the New Testament, the last thing I would bring to mind when speaking of the New Testament is the word corruption. And typically we hear that from outside advocates, from the atheists to the Muslims to other groups who will attack the reliability of the New Testament. And here we have a world-renowned New Testament scholar who published his book, and in light of the development of the New Testament, he points out a fatal flaw by identifying corruption along with the New Testament. So what does that mean to the layperson? So when we're talking about the textual manuscripts or the evidence that New Testament scholars are looking at to do their analysis on, I think it's important for everyone to understand when we look at the body of evidence, we have over 5,600 Greek manuscripts. We have over 10,000 Latin manuscripts. Now, we also have anywhere between 5,000 and 10,000 ancient versions. So we're talking about the Gothic, we're talking about the Aramaic, the Georgian, the Armenian. So when Daniel Wallace uses the term embarrassment of riches, in the sense that we have so much textual evidence for the New Testament at our hands, and compared to all the early classical literature that's out there, it's like, wow, we have an overwhelming abundance of evidence supporting the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Right.
So let's start there. So with all this evidence, like, wow, this is great. So when Bruce Metzger talks about corruption, what does that mean, and how does that apply to these manuscripts? And this is the focal point of the argument between myself, Daniel Wallace, James White, Bart Ehrman, and other New Testament textual scholars. Because what they are saying is that somewhere after the 3rd century, the historical churches, so we're talking about Antioch, Rome, Alexandria, all the churches where the text was received by the apostles, moved away from the original text that they had, and what has been witnessed, so the text that was publicly preached from the 4th century on, all the way down to the 12th, 13th century, has been the wrong text. So let's think about that for a second. Now, the names of these texts, they'll use different things. So to explain the Greek manuscripts, it's basically broken out into different categories. So if you think about it, 94% of the manuscripts we have, and this is according to Ehrman and Wallace, represent a text from the 9th century going forward. So 94% of the textual manuscripts we have are dated from the 9th to the 4th century, or the 9th to the 15th century. Now, there is a small population of manuscripts dated sometime between the 2nd and the 4th century that are different. It's a different text that is represented than the majority of manuscripts that we have. Now, one thing to keep in mind, the witness of these manuscripts or these majority manuscripts are the ones that are witnessed by the official churches. So the text that was ecclesiastically transmitted from the 4th century down to now represents that type of text. Now, the problem is, and Ehrman actually goes into this discussion, which is shared by the vast majority of New Textual Christian conservative scholars, is that we have to explain why the earliest surviving manuscripts have a text different from the majority text. Why does a different text show up early and consistently early rather than consistently later? So what New Testament textual scholars, such as James White, will say is that the scriptures that were publicly read from the 4th century onwards down throughout the Greek Orthodox churches, the Latin churches, and the Aramaic churches were the wrong type of text. So essentially, it was wrong. So they say this text is secondary origin. So let me give you a quote from Daniel Wallace when he speaks to this particular issue. Now, Daniel Wallace says Hort's, and Hort was the first one in 1881 to identify that the texts used in these earlier periods, so 2nd and 3rd century, represent a different text after the 4th century. So his theory was that somehow the churches moved away from the original editions, and that the text witnessed from the majority of manuscripts we have, we can't use because they're secondary in origin. They're late, they're inferior. They don't represent the original writings of the apostles.
I would not. I would argue against that. Actually, I would say it's more of a third reiteration, not
Okay.
second.
So, well, Daniel Wallace says Hort's threefold argument against the Byzantium text, or the text of the Greek Orthodox Church, is still a good argument that demonstrates the Byzantine text to be secondary, late, and inferior. And James White makes the same point, that most also believe the Byzantium represents a later period in which readings from other text types were put together, conflated into the Byzantium reading. Since the Byzantium text comes from a later period, the earlier texts are almost all Alexandrian and not Byzantium. And Peter Gurry also states on the Byzantium text that the Byzantium manuscripts have been disparaged by a majority of New Testament textual scholars as the least valuable for recovering the original text when considered as a whole. So Maurice Robertson explains here's what's happening. Because all these texts that are witnessed from the early church are being thrown out. So the texts that are witnessed from the Greek, the Latin, and the Aramaic churches that have ecclesiastically been transmitted down through the generations are basically wrong. And what New Testament scholars are basically saying is that we can't use those as the basis. And here's what Robertson says, Maurice Robertson, that the working presumption of most eclectic scholars, including Ehrman, is that the vast bulk of New Testament manuscripts basically should be excluded as irrelevant for the primary establishment of the text. Ehrman's statement against the comparative argument makes perfect sense. Rather than claiming some sort of text critical superiority to the classics based on sheer quantity, modern eclectics perhaps should acknowledge that they're actual preferred witnesses for establishing the best approximation to the original New Testament text number only in a few dozens, as opposed to several thousands otherwise set aside from serious consideration. Now, what we have to understand is there was an original theory that was put together by Hort in 1881 to reject these texts. And the reason why there's so much attack on the King James Version, any of the TR editions, is because they're all based on these ecclesiastical texts. And what we see at Antioch, and in my animation, I bring James White back to Antioch because in the 4th century, when Christianity finally became legal at the Edict of Milan, and we had just defeated the Arians, we now have one of the greatest preachers in the Greek Orthodox world from the oldest surviving church, Antioch, that goes back to the apostles, because Jerusalem was destroyed and didn't get rebuilt until afterwards, representing a type of text that looks like the majority of texts found in the Greek Orthodox churches that have come down to us. That's why when they first attacked, when they introduced these theories, they attacked the text of Antioch in 385 AD, because that text is, according to New Testament scholars Gordon Fee, is 90% what we'll call a type of the Byzantium text. And he made the statement that Chrysostom's text is closer to the majority text than any text of the 2nd and 3rd century.
I see. So, do you think this interpretation is more in tune with the actual word of the gospel, or do you think it has something to do with socio-political motivation?
Well, I think, what happened is, when they came across texts that the church was always aware of. We know that during the periods of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century, outside of the churches, there were other groups that were sort of Orthodox as well that also had texts, but didn't represent the official text. I mean, Jerome writes about it. Origen writes about it. Irenaeus writes about it. Tertullian does. There were other streams of texts that were in production, that were outside, that were not part of the official transmission lines of the churches.
Exactly.
And
so that's what I'm getting at when it comes to the comparison between heresy or just difference between interpretation.
Well, and I think what's happening is they have found, primarily 2 base texts, that being Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, which are 4th century biblical texts. But the question is, where did they come from? And Dr. Wasserman, who is also what's called one of the top field experts in New Testament textual criticism, said we don't know where these manuscripts come from. So, but these are the basis. So if you think about it, we have, over 25, 30,000 documents. This doesn't even include the writings of the fathers, the lectionaries, the public readings to the congregation. And all this is thrown out for texts of unknown provenance that is the basis for all new textual editions. So the text that is witnessed by the official churches that were publicly read to the congregations, the people of God, from the 4th century on downward, for texts that we don't know where they come from.
Right, but
texts that disagree amongst themselves, and the foundation of all biblical transactions, all biblical texts through the NA and the UBS are not the ones witnessed by the church, but texts that vary amongst themselves and can't be shown to ever been used by the church.
So why would that be the case that these wouldn't be used by the church if the category is Alexandrian text? We know there were churches around that time period in Alexandria that would affirm these things, especially if we're talking about Athanasius of Alexandria, who defended the Trinity.
Well, yeah, but here's the thing about that. Well, now keep in mind the term Alexandrian with the evolution of the CBGM, the term text types doesn't even exist anymore. Peter Gurry and Tommy Wasserman, that was the whole notion of text types were all made up. And the CBGM, just even though they're promoting these texts, they discredited that entire theory. Now, what's important to understand is that we have an official Church of Alexandria, and they do not use these texts. And the Greek, Antioch is part of the Greek Orthodox Church, as is Alexandria.
Right, and they not just have differences in text, there's also differences in doctrine and affirmation of canon. Like, for example, some Russian Orthodox, to point out to some of these examples within those types of churches, will affirm the Apocrypha books of the Old Testament being canon. And then you have that of some, because there was a catechism, I think it was Vladimir's Catechism is the name of it, said that the canon is the 66th book canon that the Protestants affirm. And that's where even some people will either say, this is just a difference of opinion, and others have suggested that this particular one that affirms the 66th book canon is a work inspired by Satan to deviate from the church. So, there's debate and difference even within those particular kinds of churches over this sort of thing. And I think that's the one thing we need to keep in mind, even in the textual critical thing, because some of the things that you've said, I believe, number one, I need to see some of the proof and the evidence of, for example, some of the affirmations that are said, like that. For example, in your video, you've said that James White seems to cringe at the notion of Antioch, even though I don't see where really he has a cringing notion about the text of Antioch when he's affirmed that there is no reason to reject it or to say that therefore we should reject it or deny its usage. So it shows clearly he does utilize Byzantine text, Antioch text in his research. They don't, and I have his quote right here. He doesn't. James White. Now this is from the King James Only Controversy. Following words: most also believe the Byzantium represents a later period in which readings, and now this includes the text of Antioch, that falls within scope, from other text types were put together, conflated into the Byzantium reading. So it represents a later period. This is their secondary and origin text, which readings from other text types were put together, conflated into the Byzantium reading. Since the Byzantium text comes from a later period, the earlier texts are almost all Alexandrian, not Byzantium. And that's why when Daniel Wallace also says the same thing, that the Byzantium text is secondary, late, and inferior. Okay.
And
I wouldn't necessarily say it's inferior. This does
that's what Daniel Wallace says.
Right, and here's the thing to also consider, because Ave pointed this out earlier as well to me, is that White and Wallace aren't always going to agree on certain things. And that's with any scholar, which is why you have to keep that in mind instead of trying to group them as if they're universally accepting the same exact notions. Because here's the thing, you mentioned that, but all that really mentions is that James White just mentions that these text types have a later thing. However, in the same book, in two areas, he says, number one, in the footnote in page 51, Alexandria gave us Athanasius, the great defender of the deity of Christ, while the area around Antioch in Byzantium was infested with Arians, those who denied it. Is this sufficient basis for rejecting the Byzantine text type a priori? Of course not. And then in page 119, he says, God was able to preserve their content, referring to the New Testament, through Christians everywhere in the world, at Antioch, as well as Alexandria, Jerusalem, Rome, etc. So Antioch is included as a place where the text type is used to preserve the content of the New Testament. So just because it says it's of a later period doesn't mean that therefore James White thinks that it's not to be used and therefore it's somehow not able to show and preserve the Word of God of the New Testament. So that means, because he clearly affirms that in the book, in page 119, as well as showing we can't just simply dismiss it in page 51.
Well, now here, this is from Peter Gurry, who is
Right,
one of the top.
but before you go to Peter Gurry, I mean, because I wasn't addressing Peter Gurry. I don't even know who he is. I'm talking about James White with the accusation that's leveled against him, who seems to be, from what I see, most of your focus is in some of the videos.
Well, he doesn't support it. The Byzantium text is not the basis of their textual editions, and Peter Gurry, Dr. Peter Gurry, who works on this, they're friends. James White is having him on his show. He supports his book, and he makes the point that James White rejects it. Mm-hmm. And he says the issue is whether apologists like James White or Dan Wallace, for example, are being inconsistent for practicing reasoned eclecticism and for appealing to vast number of Greek New Testament manuscripts. Mm-hmm. Wallace, for example, likes to refer to our embarrassment of riches. Mm-hmm. But his practice of reasoned eclecticism seems to suggest that he's embarrassed in quite a different way by these riches because he doesn't actually use them. Mm-hmm. Apologetically, he wants to have his embarrassingly rich cake, but text critically, he has already eaten it.
Okay.
So this is where Maurice Robertson is saying the working presumption of most eclectic scholars is that the vast bulk of New Testament manuscripts basically should be excluded as irrelevant for the primary establishment of the text. And they're only using a few dozen non-Byzantium texts. They're using Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, Theological editions, and some higher, as opposed to the several thousand for their textual foundations.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
so, but here's
James White would agree with that statement.
Mm-hmm. Right.
He rejects. He calls them the later ecclesiastical texts. Mm-hmm. They're secondary. They're not to be used. And Peter Gurry confirms in his book that the Byzantium.
You're going off a distance.
Sorry. He says the Byzantium manuscripts have been disparaged by a majority of New Testament textual critics as the least valuable for recovering the original text.
And what's that key word there?
Original.
Original.
Well, there's that, but there's most. Doesn't mean that every single person therefore is involved in it. For example, I have here Charles E. Hill in the book called The Biblical Theological Introduction to the New Testament, and in the section of the appendix entitled The New Testament Text, where they discuss issues of the practice of textual criticism, they have listed here the textual groupings of New Testament manuscripts, where he says the following. The following list is intended to assist the student in forming judgments on the external evidence, which is, according to earlier in the book, that the practice of New Testament textual criticism allows for three broad areas to investigate: external evidence and the two subdivisions of internal evidence, which is transcriptional probability and intrinsic probability. And what is one of the groups that is listed here in this? The A group witnesses, otherwise known as the Byzantine, which includes P42, P84, as well as the A, E, F, G, H, K, P, S, V, W texts. That's for the Gospels. But then you have Acts with P74, HA, LAP, PA, P64. Then that's for Acts. P64 for the epistles, as well as P74 and LAP. And then you have Revelation with the different minuscule texts for there. So these are listed as something that is used for New Testament textual critical studies that are used. And this is not just of Charles E. Hill's opinion. The reason this is included in the book is that this book itself has several scholars on board trying to affirm and approve of what's being said here, like Michael J. Kruger, William B. Barclay, Robert J. Caro, Benjamin Glad, Charles E. Hill, who was the one who wrote that article, Reggie M. Kidd, Simon J. Keismaker, Bruce A. Lowe, Guy Prentice Waters. So these are scholars of today's field and affirm that we are to utilize these particular texts when engaging in textual criticism, and even says that this is the text types that are encouraged of the students to look into and to investigate, to form the judgments based off of external evidence. So Byzantine text type is used as an external evidence to examine, and so just because one guy says something of this,
this is remember Maurice Robertson. The working presumption is that the vast bulk of New Testament manuscripts should be excluded as relevant for the primary establishment of the text.
And I disagree with her. So what would you say?
I don't think so.
Right, exactly. So I'm not talking about. I'm not talking about Maurice. I'm talking about these guys. Okay, well, talk about these guys.
They exclude them.
They exclude Charles. They exclude Charles E. Hill.
I'm not sure who Charles. I mean, Peter Gurry, Maurice Wright. These are all top New Testament textual scholars in the field.
Well,
and these are the ones that are working with Nestle Allen, UBS, for the foundation of the text. And the working theory for this school of thought since 1881 was to attack the ecclesiastical texts, to exclude them from the textual foundation for their claims. They are rejected. They're considered inferior, secondary in origin, which not only means inferior, but they're an evolutionary text that came about, and that's why all these things were added to it. So when Bruce Megger says corrupt, they said the text was corrupted from the time of the 4th century, basically up until 1881, where they made the discovery that the church had been in error since the 4th century. And Ehrman makes that point. He says, I suppose I know every major textual scholar who's personally or through email or just through the reading of their work today, and I don't know anyone who buys the argument except for fundamentalist Christians who are convinced that for theological reasons, God would not have allowed the original text to be lost for many, many centuries until the labors of modern scholarship could uncover it based on a study of the earliest manuscripts.
Right.
No, that has nothing to do with God believing that humans can lose these texts. No, that's not what we're talking about here.
Right.
No, but this is what the scholars are saying.
Right, but some people will say things, but here's the thing. You mentioned those people. I've talked about the people that are today in seminaries, like Charles E. Hill, who is a New Testament scholar at Reformed Theological Seminary in Orlando, Florida. He is the one that made the claim here that this is what's being encouraged for people to look at. And this is a textbook, as far as what I'm aware of, is being used in seminaries, from what I gather to understand, to encourage people to look into these particular things, these particular
and I'm not sure about it. And there's many people in the field. I mean, it's not just, this is one school of thought that dominates the Bible publishing industry. And Maurice Robertson, he supports the Byzantium text form, and there's many that do. Now the question and the thing that and it's not only me, there are many people that have dedicated to go against what they're saying.
Yeah, including James White, to go against what people like Bart Ehrman say.
Well, yeah, but he agrees with Bart Ehrman that the text from the 4th century that was witnessed from the ecclesiastical churches are to be excluded from the textual foundation.
Where does James White say that?
But not
those words exactly. Where does James White say that these are to be excluded for research, when so far in the book I quoted, he seems to suggest that therefore it shows preservation of the word, therefore what that means we don't use it? I highly doubt that based off what I've seen in his debates.
He said most also believe the Byzantium represents a later period in which readings from other text types were put together, conflated, that means it's a corrupt text. He's talking about the conflation that they initially proposed at Antioch, that Lucan of Antioch, who did an edition of the Septuagint, took all these texts together and created what's known as the Byzantium text form, which is an inferior text. It means it's secondary in origin. And he said, most believe the Byzantium represents a later period in which the readings from other text types were put together, conflated in the Byzantium reading.
So I got the text quote here, page 45, where it says talking about the fuller later text, and that is taken evidence as a later origin or whatever. Doesn't, so far from what your whole thing has been, though, with what the quote is, he's just saying most scholars say this.
Most also believe he doesn't support the Byzantium text type.
From what I quoted, though, it seems that he seems to affirm that, as well as in the debates that he has said. He has pointed out there are variants in it. Doesn't mean, therefore, if variant, automatically dismiss it, though. That's not what that automatically means.
Well, Peter Gurian, I can send this to you. He says that
I care about James White. I'm not caring about Peter Gurian at this point, because the claim is that
he's giving a statement that they reject.
Hang on. You're saying James White says this, not Peter Gurian. Then show me the quote where he himself is saying that I, James White, am denouncing the usage of this Byzantium text. He says so far in the quote that you've given that it's a later tradition thing, but that doesn't automatically mean that he's rejecting the usage of it.
They reject these texts. This is the theory. So
but I want the quote from James that he says that he himself is rejecting the usage of it. Because as I pointed out, you say they. Well, I mentioned some scholars that are New Testament. Well, I quoted Charles Hill, who doesn't dismiss it.
Guys, this is not supposed to be a heated debate. We have to look into the distortion of the text and why exactly certain scholars would disagree on the interpretation of this. All right, like let's not start yelling at each other here, okay? Like,
right. I'm just trying to get an answer about this thing, because look, my whole thing has not been about because I agree, like Bart Ehrman, for example, being one of the people that's leading in the field, but as I told you before, he's the Mitt Romney of New Testament scholars. He will flip-flop himself very often, and you can easily see this demonstrated, where he'll say New Testament Trinity is invented because of like 1 John 5:7, but in an interview with a Muslim, he says that that's not the only text that can mention the Trinity. There's several texts all over the Bible that mention the Trinity and is the basis of the Trinity. He said that, how can the New Testament be written by their authors when they were illiterate fishermen? But then in an interview with I forget what the guy's name was, the black atheist or the chocolate atheist or something, he said that because he tried to go about defending Jesus' existence, but wasn't Paul illiterate? But then Barman's like, yeah, but he had scribes to write for him. Doesn't mean he didn't write or author the thing. He just had a scribe to write for him. So, doesn't mean. So he flip-flops and changes his position quite often. But again, him, Maurice Robertson, whoever this other guy is that James White had on his show, those are not the people I'm addressing, because here's where the whole thing got started to invite you onto the show, was the fact that the video that we got from you seems to put in, and especially on our Twitter back and forth, that this is such a big issue for Christians that if it's about as much of an issue as bad theology is, I believe is one of the words that you utilize. But if that's the case, then here's how bad theology harms the evangelical church. People are non-Christians, heretics, apostates from the faith. That's usually what we get in that. So when we make that comparison, that does shed a light of doubt onto the genuineness of someone's Christian faith and Christian beliefs. So, and that's what we usually had seen in the video, especially at one point where an accusation was made, and this was, of course, in the very early videos you made, that James White and Wallace were promoting Gnostic texts to read and utilize.
No, let me give some clarification of that. Now, what what this argument goes back to is in the 2nd century, Marcion, who was a member of a church in Rome, you know, made an accusation against the official churches. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
that the churches themselves took upon themselves for theological purposes to actually interpolate the text of the New Testament, and that the original form of the text was Luke and 10 letters of Paul was his argument. Now, Price goes to that argument. He goes to the 2nd century. Bauer used that argument as the basis to say that the New Testament canon and the scriptures, it was a byproduct of the New Testament churches responding against Marcion with these texts. Now, this argument that is made against the ecclesiastical text, so that these are the texts that are witnessed from the churches. They say that they're interpolated, they're inferior, they're a product of a conflation. When James White in that passage says about the conflation, he's talking about the 4th century recession, that they put these texts together, and that is why the Byzantium text was created. They're taking all these texts together and morphing it into one. And that's why we can't use it, because we can't get to the original text, because the earlier text represents something different. And it's not only James White, it's this entire school of thought that has rejected all these texts. And, what's interesting is that the Greek Orthodox Church in 1904, as sort of their response to it, because we're talking about the texts from the churches of the apostles. The official Greek Orthodox Church themselves, which includes Alexandria, Antioch, all the Church of Jerusalem. These churches, they came out and they defended the Byzantium text and actually rejected these earlier texts that they're using as the basis of their edition. So what I'm asking you guys is the idea, and this is where I say it's just as, it's probably in some ways, because, what develops our theology is our text.
Yeah.
This idea that the text was lost for, literally over 1,000 years, is the message of the Bible, that the word of God was lost, because these are what these guys are saying.
I don't ever hear
No,
James White
no,
ever.
I don't believe it was.
Right, and I
It
don't
was
hear
not
James
lost for
White.
1,000 years.
Right, and I don't hear James White or Daniel Wallace ever saying that we've lost the text. I have never heard a single word. Wallace, probably, but then again, he is trying to be about as lenient as he can with the whole textual critical methodology, but James White, never ever heard him say that we have had a moment where it was lost. In fact, he's made that accusation towards people of the King James only people, that they're the ones that will usually bring up and say that somehow there's a lost text or something, and that the King James is now that particular one. But James White himself has argued against that and then said, well, we have always had the correct text. He has never once, from what I have listened to, from what I have read, from what I have analyzed, that there was ever any thing that said, well, we have lost the text, which is where the other thing that kind of got me off was whenever the Herbert-looking woman appears in the video of the Halloween special and says, the correct text, where can I get the correct text? And apparently,
they have to wait until 1881.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's what they're saying.
No, where though? Where has James White said you have to wait till 1881, or that 1881 is where the correct text shows? Because he has affirmed that there's previous passages, previous manuscripts, especially codexes, that have the correct text. That even the other texts that exist out there, even in the Byzantium tradition, had the correct text.
Well, no, they say that the Byzantium is a byproduct. It's inferior. It's secondary in origin. It's conflated. It doesn't represent the original text, and that's what they're saying. It's but have been disparaged by the majority of New Testament as the least valuable for recovering the original text because
Okay,
it's
so let's say you had the original text and it was handed down century after century. How is it
yes.
still not viable for continued research and interpretation? Like,
Mm-hmm.
did it change over those
That's what they're
centuries,
saying.
or is it the original text that people have been still studying over the course of that time? How is
They
it still
say,
not,
well,
important or viable?
they said it changed. That's what they're saying happened at Antioch. They originally proposed that the text was corrupted at Antioch. That's why.
Corrupted.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Uh-huh. Well, when they say conflated, when they're putting three texts together that don't represent the original, you have a conflation where all these other readings are added to the text that are not part of the original. Because they
Right.
had
So
to,
they're okay. So they're added, but that does not necessarily mean that the original word is not still there, right?
Right.
It
well,
would be, wouldn't it?
yeah, but they moved away from the text. So us talk about the text that came down from Antioch in the fourth century that's publicly preached to the people. They're saying does not represent the original text of the New Testament. That text does not look like the text of the second and third century, and that's a statement that they make. Gordon Fee stated, and this is a scholarship that White, Wallace, and this entire school of thought follows. That's why Gordon Fee makes a statement that Chrysostom's text is closer to the majority text. The later texts that have been morphed and changed than the texts of the second and third century. That there was a pure form of the text, and by means of these recessions, and that's why there was so much. When this first came out, remember the Church of England, which I'm a part of, was
Mm-hmm.
part of this initial process,
Mm-hmm.
and there was no problem in the beginning of polishing up the authorized version.
Mm-hmm.
The issue came about is when they brought in texts of unknown provenance like Sinaiticus and Vaticanus that don't look anything like the fourth century texts used by Jerome in Rome and at Antioch, and
I,
look like
I,
the
I,
text.
I still don't understand how the original text can somehow be lost with the additions of additional ones.
Well, if you change the text, so if you mix it all together and think about it,
Oh,
this is where
so you're talking about editing in regards to
no, adding. I mean, when you're talking about creating a new text,
Mm-hmm.
they're adding all these things to it, and we're not talking about one or two passages. We're talking about hundreds of additions that occurred over time, and that's why they reject the use of these texts because they are so corrupt. They don't use it.
Mm-hmm.
that's the that's where the corruption argument comes from.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I
And
understand that.
and think about it. Bruce Metzger puts it on his book. It's not like they're hiding it. James
Mm-hmm.
White uses his textual commentary. The
Mm-hmm.
text of the New Testament, its transmission, corruption, and restoration.
Mm-hmm.
What they are trying to do now is restore the text back to its original form. Because the text
Mm-hmm.
that has come down and has been witnessed by the Greek, the Latin, and the Aramaic official churches were wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And so now they're trying to restore all these corruptions that occurred within
Mm-hmm.
the churches back
Right.
to the original form.
Right, and I want to get onto something here with it. Now, was it Robertson or Robinson? Because I keep hearing
Or
Maurice.
yeah, Maurice Robertson. So he defends
Hold on. Robert or Robinson?
Maurice Robertson.
Robinson. Okay. So here's the thing that I wanted to point out from what I'm looking at. So you think that Maurice Robinson is against Byzantine priority text?
No, he's for Byzantine priority.
Okay.
He's for it.
Okay.
He's attacking these scholars like Wallace and White and all them that their textual foundations are based only on a few dozen manuscripts. So the 25,000 that we have, so the Vulgate, the textual work that Jerome did, Byzantium text form. He supports Byzantium, and what he's pointing out in this statement is that the working presumption of most eclectic scholars is that the vast bulk of New Testament manuscripts basically should be excluded as irrelevant for the primary establishment of the text.
Okay. So,
and what they're doing here is throwing away all the church texts for texts where we don't know where any of these things belong to.
Okay, so let me point out something here, because here's the thing. The field of it will include scholars who will either remain not wanting to investigate further into things, or they will just be curious to get into so. Now, the kind of scholar that would be against, or that you would say that is sort of against Maurice Robinson and all these other things, would be people like Craig A. Evans, who is a New Testament textual critic. He has written several books on this kinds of issues about textual criticism and all these things. And there's a book that came out called The Original Ending of Mark by Nicholas P. Lunn. Have you ever heard of the book?
No, I haven't heard of that one.
I would recommend getting this, because what this book shows and utilizes is what you are criticizing James White and Daniel Wallace of the textual critical method that they utilize. This Nicholas P. Lunn uses that textual critical method to prove the authenticity of the original ending of Mark being of verses 9, including verses 9 through 20. And as we mentioned, that in the New Testament introduction that I cited, where Charles E. Hill gave the criteria, he mentions external evidence is one of those criteria. And right here in one of the chapters is external evidence. It includes the Alexandrian, the Byzantine text is to be used. And Craig Evans gives us support of Nicholas P. Lunn's book by saying, quote, Nicholas Lunn has thoroughly shaken my views concerning the ending of the Gospel of Mark. As in the case of most gospel scholars, I have for my whole career held that Mark 16 verses 9 through 20, the so-called long ending, was not original. But in his well-researched and carefully argued book, Lunn successfully succeeds in showing just how flimsy that position really is. So this is something where, by utilizing this kind of textual critical methodology in your field of research, new material comes out that can prove things and change our positions on certain things, including the issue of here that we could just use not just church fathers, but we can just go to Codex Sinaiticus and prove the authenticity of verses 9 through 20. And I will demonstrate where from the quote that is utilized.
Sinaiticus doesn't have 9 through 12.
Right, but have you looked at the manuscript of Sinaiticus?
Yeah, well, they try to argue from the blank page that the problem with that, the thing is, first is provenance. Where does it, because those are the two texts, the two Greek manuscripts only, they're basing their decision on that and a comment from Eusebius. Those are the only two texts that have it. Every other Greek manuscript that has that section of Mark has the last 12 verses. Mm-hmm. So,
here's the thing. Because I'm pointing out where the issue is here from, according to P. Lunn, because he doesn't just go to Eusebius to support this. He goes even further in more extensive detail and even points out other examples where this phenomenon is shown. So he says, quote, the phenomenon most relevant regarding the ending of Mark in Vaticanus is the presence of a blank column following the close of this gospel. Throughout the manuscript is the scribal custom to leave the remainder of a column empty between the end of one book and the beginning of the next. However, following Mark 16:8 and the concluding subscription kata makon, not only is the rest of the second column left unused, but the whole of the third also before the commencement of Luke on the next leaf. Despite the protestations of some, the fact is that the gap at the end of Mark's gospel is unique. It is certainly unparalleled in the New Testament portion of the manuscript. Objectors point out that 3 such gaps are to be found in the Old Testament portion of Vaticanus at the end of Daniel, Tobit, and 2nd Esdras. Yet in all these cases, there are explainable factors governing the presence of the space. Daniel is the last book, and as Snap observes, I'm sure you're familiar with Snap,
yeah, I know Snap.
Observes, for a large space to appear at such a major juncture is practically inevitable. Regarding 2nd Esdras, this is the book immediately preceding the Psalms. there is a transition of genre here from history to poetry. In Vaticanus, the former book is inscribed using 3 columns per page, while the latter has just 2. This reduction from 3 to 2 columns required leaving the page blank, allowing the end of Second Esdras. An identical feature occurs in Sinaiticus at the equivalent place. Coming to Tobit, the reason for the unused space is not immediately apparent. This has prompted some to reject any line of argumentation based upon the presence of empty columns. Actually, there's a very good reason for the gap at this precise point. Following Tobit in Vaticanus, this is where the key is, following on the issue of Tobit. Following Tobit in Vaticanus comes the Minor Prophets. That is, this location marks the transition from the wisdom book to the prophetic, beginning with Hosea. Study of the manuscript has shown that here there occurs not only a literary transition from one genre to another, but also a physical point of juncture, and that there is a join between one choir and another. Tobit is the last book on choir 49 of the manuscript, and Hosea the first on choir 50. Not only this, there remain traces of a page that has been cut off from the end of choir 49. Evidently, the number of pages in the choir exceed the material to be copied into them, and so the spare leaf was excised. This, of course, could not be done with the remaining blank space on the last page used. Moreover, the style of handwriting indicates that the scribe who copied out Tobit was different from the copyist of Hosea. The vacant column, therefore, is evidently due to a second scribe who commenced his work on a new section of the canon upon a new choir of parchment, which was later sewn together with the earlier choir following the removal of the latter's final empty leaf. In the case of the ending of Mark in Vaticanus, no such factors as those just described are discernible. There is no sewing together of different choirs, and the scribal hand that continues after the blank column is identical to that preceding. This particular manner of empty space is then strictly unique to the conclusion of Mark in the entire manuscript. The simplest and most obvious explanation to account for the space is that the scribe knew of the longer ending. It is possible that 16 verses 9 through 20 was missing from his exemplar, and so he let the remainder of the page blank in order that at a later date, if required, the missing text could be added. The amount of space is adequate for all 12 verses to be copied, though with slightly but not overly compressed lettering. The scribe no doubt merely estimated the space needed, probably from memory, rather than measuring it according to the exact number of letters. And consider that they are good, at least at keeping up memory with that, considering the oral tradition at that time. Keep that in mind, folks. It is unlikely to have been the shorter ending that he had in mind, since this could have been fitted into the remaining part of the final column immediately following 16:8. So there are good arguments regarding the authenticity of the fact that that blank space that is utilized at Vaticanus and can be sort of seen in Sinaiticus, that we can see that someone was expecting a later scribe, much like in the same way it was done in regards to Tobit and Hosea, that a later scribe would come, and that this one just didn't have the text materials for the copying of the verses 9 through 20, and therefore he probably was waiting for someone else who had that material to finish the rest of the work.
Okay, but and I'm not a totally. I know Bergen used it. I spoke to James on that, Snap on that argument, and yeah, it's an interesting thing. Now, the thing about Jerome is it's included in the Vulgate. We know Jerome. We know Jerome's methodology. We know who trained him. He said he basically, is going to the Greek text. That's 4th century or early for the basis of his edition.
Yeah.
Augustine vetted his edition against Greek texts he had in North Africa and found nothing to object to. Even though he was aware of Eusebius's comment that talked about manuscripts that didn't have it, he gave it its blessing and seal. And all over the ancient world in the 4th century, in Syria, at Antioch, the official churches of the apostles witness to those 12 verses. And it goes all the way back to the 2nd century with Irenaeus at Asia Minor, quoting that passage. Now, remember, New Testament scholars, all these guys, James White, well, they all deny that. And even though I get the arguments that they're making on that, they could say the same thing for 1 John 5:7 in Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. There's there's scribal marks in there that indicate a variant may be here in 1 John 5:7. But the basis of our argument is, first, we don't know where any of these texts come from. We don't know who they belong to. And they've admitted we don't know where these texts come from.
But do we
We
have
know
to, though?
True, but if you can reference them in regards to the original context of the gospel itself, then why can you not? Does it actually matter where they came from?
Exactly.
Or are they just reiterations of the original gospel themselves from the apostles?
Right.
Well,
Isn't that what's more important here?
Because they'll
Well,
match some of
the thing
the.
is,
They'll match
they-
in certain
do.
places. They'll
They
match in
do.
certain. They'll match in certain places with
Well, but-
the
Yes.
Antioch text.
Right,
no, they're
exactly.
different. They're
Well,
different. The thing is, the 4th century text, Antioch, Chrysostom's text of Antioch is 4th century. That church does go back to the apostles.
Okay.
We know the leaders of that church. We know
Okay.
Antioch received the original scriptures.
Okay, so let me
And
ask this. Let me
Right,
ask this.
right, right.
Let me just ask this real quick then, so that way I don't forget it. If we pull up an Antioch manuscript or an Antioch text tradition and show it with a manuscript from the Alexandrian tradition of John 3:16, how different is it going to be?
I'm not sure. I haven't looked at, but those texts are different. They agree that the texts are different.
Well,
And-
that's the thing, though. That's the thing. Exactly how different will they actually be?
Because here's the thing, not this is
5,000
because this
differences?
is noted. You will find, if you examine every manuscript of every ancient work of antiquity, there is not going to be a single bit of uniformity in terms of it, including the Quran, including the New Testament. And this is where we're definitely different in the thing. Old Testament will have its differences as well, because there is variants within the Old Testament manuscript tradition, and some try to argue that these are differences in variation of doctrine, but yet no Jewish scholar seems to think so in terms of the those who are actually faithful to the text, and those in the Christian world that are faithful to the text that think that there be some liberal Jews and there'll be some non-religious scholars of the Old Testament, like Dr. Joshua Bowen, for example, who will affirm and think that there's some variation probably that has an alteration in doctrine or something like that, but that doesn't automatically mean that they're right. Just because they're a scholar, even Bart Ehrman himself has admitted and said, just because a bunch of scholars say something doesn't make it true. But if you have something,
I agree.
But he says if you have some disagreement with them, you better have a good line of evidence for it, and that's why I can appreciate the works in the Old Testament critical thinking, where the idea of Moses not existing is the majority scholarship, not just in the non-religious, but even among the Christian so-called camps, are rejecting his existence, and yet we have people in the camp of the faithful evangelicals that are going after this notion with different theories, and as well as revamping certain things, like Gordon Wenham, for example, regarding the what is do we go with documentary hypothesis? Do we go with fragmentary hypothesis? Do we go with supplementary?
Or JPT or
JPT and all that stuff, and that's not the only theory, but
that's for me, Moses wrote the books.
Right.
There's and so the thing here, and here's the biggest problem, and it's not only me, but people who are writing against this on the other side too, is that should we be rejecting the official text from the church for texts of unknown provenance?
Mm-hmm.
So the witness of the church, and if you think about it, the churches were the vehicle and means for God to transmit scriptures down to the generations of today.
Mm-hmm.
So, and you're talking about the Catholic Church, right?
No. I'm talking about the Church Universal. So apart from Rome, I'm an Anglican. We rejected Rome.
I see.
Before Trent, we wanted them out of the realm of England, and we burnt and bled, not only to get the New Testament out to people in English, but for defending the Anglican. Remember, the Greek Orthodox Church can't stand the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church was one church.
I understand.
Right, the Great
Okay.
Yeah,
Schism, right?
yeah. So I mean, the Church of England separated
Hmm.
from the communion with the Roman Catholic Church,
Hmm.
just as the Greek Church did over 1,000 years ago.
Hmm. By the
So
way, I just want to say I'm about to use the restroom real quick and take my medicine. Ave, you can ask any questions or anything until by the time I get back, because I do want to bring up something, since that you did mention the issue of going to the church for establishing the text. And if that's the case, I want to bring up a point, since you brought up something else that's similar to that, and what actually some church fathers have tried to make an argument for. So I will be right back.
yeah,
All
so
right. Well, I'm
yeah,
not exactly sure what
yeah,
what you
so
brought up here, but yes.
yeah.
Uh,
Now the point I want to make
mhm.
is, I'm not against textual criticism. I think textual science is good. Uh, the biblical scholarship of Jerome, Thomas of Harkle, who did the Philokian, the Gothic edition that was done by Euphilus in the fourth century, the works of the Anglican clergy with the authorized version, Theodore Beza, Cardinal Jimenez,
Right,
all of this.
absolutely. I
I
greatly
I,
value,
su-
intellectual,
I support
interpretation.
all that work. I'm not against textual criticism. But the argument I'm making to these textual scholars, and I've asked them personally, why do we continue to reject the vast majority of textual evidence from the ecclesiastical churches? So that's the Vulgate, that's the Byzantium text form, that's the Aramaic Peshitta. Why are we rejecting the church texts for texts of unknown provenance that serve as the basis of our textual editions? And that's where the textual Frankenstein comes in, is because they're taking all these texts that they don't know where it's coming from and putting them together as the form of the text. It'd be different if the weight of the evidence, the foundation was based on the text that was received by the church. I mean, that's
Yes.
all. That's all the Textus Receptus means, is the text that was commonly received by the apostolic churches. So what we're advocating for is the text of the received text of the apostolic churches be the basis for the textual editions.
Right, but
Uh-huh.
But
even
But that's what I was saying earlier. When in regards to at least the Byzantium text, I'm not going to talk about the Alexandrian doctrine, but
mhm.
uh, um,
but
how is it unreasonable to bring up the idea that people in the Byzantine era, of just history in general, would find these older texts and still use them, and how is that not still viable in regards to
well,
modern doctrine
well,
or interpretation?
well,
Like that's what I'm saying.
I think what we have to be aware of is that there were texts in history. I mean, because when we look at Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, you have two major scriptures that are not in there. That if it's true, and I do believe that the woman in adultery and the last 12 verses of Mark were original, the fact that they're not in there is not a mistake. It's not a scribal transposition or I left off a word. Those are significant portions of scripture, which really shows uh, the character of that text. So, whoever the author was, if those passages were original and they're not in there,
Mhm.
shows the true nature of those texts to be corrupt. Because to take something out that belongs, we're not talking about a couple of words or you've got to include something. Those are major sections, and they're
I'm not sure about that though, because now it almost seems like to me you change your definition of corrupt, because
Mhm.
here you're saying that they disregarded certain texts that should have been there, but earlier you said that it was corrupt because they added things that should not have
well,
been there. So now I'm
both
not
things.
really sure exactly what you're saying here.
Well, both are corruptions.
Oh, both
So
of them. Oh, okay. Well,
yeah,
that was not
whether you
clarified.
add something or you take it away. I mean, and Irenaeus makes this point with the groups of his time.
Yep.
That there was groups removing stuff from the sacred scriptures, and then there were those that were adding things onto the scriptures as well. So both, whether you're adding or you're taking away, I mean,
So any type of changes, more or less, right?
yeah, those
Okay,
and
so that should have been clarified from the start, because like what you originally said was we have the original text, we know exactly what the original apostles said, and but when they added things, that was corrupt, and
okay,
now
yeah, I apologize for not clear. And
okay,
what I was trying to demonstrate is their view of the Byzantium text, or the text of the Greek Orthodox Church, went through an evolutionary development where things were being added and creating. So they say we have more of the New
right.
Testament than what was originally received, and what we're trying to do is cut off those scriptures to get it back down to the original.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So let me chime in here. So you mentioned that the text has been established by the church.
Well, not by the church; it's the witnesses. So we have independent witnesses throughout a vast geographic area
Mm-hmm.
that witness basically to the same type of text that has come down through the churches. So when we look in the West, in the East, over in the Aramaic, it represents the same type of text that came on. And so when we get to the Reformation, they did notice that there were differences between the Greek text, because after Constantinople was taken by the Turks, a lot of the Greeks were coming over into Europe at that time, and they noticed that between the Vulgate, which was the text that had come down through the Western churches, and that the Greek text, especially those coming out of Constantinople, that there were some differences.
Mm-hmm.
And when they went to reconcile those differences, that is what the Texas or the received text is. So it's working out those differences between the Greek and the Latin and Aramaic textual traditions. But
But here's the thing. So would Jerome be a witness?
of course he is,
Okay, so
because
but let's okay, so he wrote the Vulgate,
well,
and
he did an edition of the New Testament. We know his methodology. He
mm-hmm.
says he wanted to restore it back to the original Greek because there was problems in the Latin translation.
Yeah. But
We
what all does the
know
Vulgate consist of?
what is it? It's a Latin translation of the Greek New Testament.
Okay, so it's a Latin translation of the Greek New Testament.
Yeah, so it was done in the fourth century. So he went to fourth century or earlier Greek manuscripts as the basis for his edition.
Okay.
Now the beauty of it is we have his letters to Marcella, basically saying, "Here's my criteria. I'm not changing anything. I'm not trying to add anything on. The basis is to restore it to the Greek originals due to some of the problems that we have in the Latin translations." And he went to the church to get permission to do this, and which we see in his preface. But because of the they wanted to make sure that Jerome was doing right by it, Augustine in North Africa, representing a totally different church,
Mm-hmm.
what's called, because when it was sent over to North Africa, the Old Testament had a problem with one of the translations that erupted into a big a big riot in one of the churches over the changing of one word in Job. So they were very concerned about what Jerome was doing on the New Testament Gospels. But when Augustine and North African churches looked at it, because it came into North Africa, the Vulgate, they checked it against their own Greek manuscripts or century and compared what Jerome did, and they found nothing to object to in the New Testament Gospels.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a witness there in the fourth century in North Africa. We know the Vulgate text and in Antioch. So we have three epicenters of Christianity that represent a text that does not look like their fourth century Sinaiticus and Vaticanus.
Hmm.
I mean, they all understand this.
Right.
That
But
text. So three areas of Christianity witness to a text that these against two texts we don't know where we come from. So
okay.
why would we reject the witness of the churches that the apostles had established as
Hmm.
guardians and witness of the text
Right.
for texts we don't know where they come from?
And so, what? How many books of are in the Latin Vulgate that Jerome produced?
Oh, Jerome rejected the Apocrypha, even though
In
he
the beginning,
included
he
it.
did. In the beginning, he did.
Now, he rejected that. He rejected the additional verses of Daniel,
And he
and
again originally he did, but then if you continue reading his works, especially like in Against Rufinus, he then has to apologize and say, I was wrong for rejecting these books. I now see that these are to be part of the text, and that is why the Latin Vulgate does contain the they call it the deuterocanonical books or the Apocrypha, because he later on changed his mind on the usage of the Apocrypha after his peers were getting into disagreement with him about it, and he eventually caved in and said, I was wrong. These texts, the Apocrypha, do need to go into here. And you would.
but he does make the distinction, just like that they should not be included for doctrine. So he does make the statement that they should not be used to base off any doctrine.
And does this come after his writing Against Rufinus?
I would have to check on that, but the
Right.
Vulgate, Sinaiticus has documents in there that in Vatican that are apocryphal,
Right.
but
And
we
that's
know
why and
Jerome
that's why
and
people like, for example, David A. De Silva notes that just because a certain thing has all those books doesn't mean that they viewed it as canonical.
no, and I understand. I mean, Augustine, the North African Church, because it came in with the Septuagint,
Mm-hmm.
they did not want to reject it because it's something that they received. Their whole thing was to preserve what has been handed down. So I understand in the North African Church why they didn't want to just throw it away. Now, it was a different thing about establishing doctrine, but the thing about keeping what had been received and preserved, the thing is, we have a New Testament document that is based on Greek witnesses, 4th century or early,
Mm-hmm.
that was vetted by Augustine and the North African churches and found not to have any problems in the passages. And at Antioch, I mean, we're talking about churches of the apostles that are witnessing against two texts that they're basing their textual editions off of, and they're rejecting the churches. They don't even consider the Latin information worthy at all. Uh, I mean, the Aramaic. So what they're saying is, and this is what I want to ask you, RC,
Mm-hmm.
this idea that, and you could write James White personally. He knows what I said, and I wrote him personally too.
Yeah.
Let's get on the air and let's talk about these things because he is a good Christian. There's a lot of good things that he does, but I feel this is where he's losing the intellectual argument on this when he goes to the scholarship because they're rejecting all the church texts for texts that they don't know where they're going. And should we be rejecting all the church texts?
And I don't ever hear him saying we should reject the church text. That's where, again, to me, that kind of claim, unless you have him saying these exact words and you can show him saying those words, I'm sorry, to me, that just sounds like a lie.
Yeah.
And
Well, okay. I wouldn't say a lie person. Well, in that regard, yes, but he's not rejecting all of the church texts. Basically, it seems to me there are some things that you vehemently disagree with about him with, and it's very important that you do address this directly with him. And I'm glad that you did that.
yeah.
But to make this blanket statement that he's disregarding all text, I don't think that's necessarily fair.
Well, I mean, Robertson makes that point that the working presumption of most eclectic scholars, this is Ehrman, this is Wallace, this is on the This is on their blog talking about Wallace and White. This is is that the vast bulk of New Testament manuscripts basically should be excluded as irrelevant for the primary establishment of the text.
And whose blog?
And huh? Do you want me to send you the link so you have it?
Yeah, I mean, I would like to see the blog from White or Wallace
Well,
where they say this.
Wallace,
Huh?
right here. He's talking about, and White wouldn't disagree with that statement. And this is why I'm saying it's really important to understand what these issues are from what they're saying, because, and I get it, White's not going to just come out and say, hey, by the way, this is what I'm doing. But this is what they're saying. And I mean, Gurry, he's one of them. He supports the rejection of all these scripts. I have their statements.
Okay, but here's the thing to consider, and this is where I very much find it disingenuous when I've done it looked into the Old Testament study field, where when one person tries to go and examine that, if someone goes into Old Testament textual criticism or is in this field, then all of a sudden the claim is made that these people are trying to attack the authority or the reliability of the Bible. Like, for example, Gleason Archer was one of those kinds of people that was sort of given that accusation. There's several people that are given that because of similar things that then you're given the raising of the accusation against New Testament scholars, not just in general, or well, in a way, in general, because it's not just the non-believing ones that make up theories that won't have any hold or weight, but you're also going against the people that are doing this work just so to defend the Christian faith, to show the reliability and the preservation of the Word of God, like James White, Daniel Wallace, and others. And this is where I definitely find the idea ridiculous, is when you say that, well, he's not really going to come out and say this whole thing, but in reality, this is the same kind of thing I hear about people that are like against Muslims saying, well, they're not going to really tell you what they're thinking. It's all taqiya. All Muslims are bloodthirsty savages who want to blow up your buildings and all that kind of stuff. And people say the same thing about Christians, that we don't really try to come out and say what we genuinely and actually believe. So,
James White would agree with me on that statement. That's now Elijah Hickson.
So how do you know that he would agree with you on that statement? Does he say something where he has stated that we are to dismiss these texts for research?
Oh yeah, I just sent you the article. Peter Gurry, they're friends. They get along. Peter Gurry is one of the top New Testament scholars working on the CBGM. And what he's accusing them of in the article, and it's not to be mean to them, is the fact that they appeal. And this is the problem we have, because James White, Daniel Wallace, say, hey, we have 5,000 manuscripts, but they reject most of them. And that's what Maurice Robertson is making in the argument. And this is what Bart Ehrman accuses them of. You can't appeal to evidence that you reject. Daniel Wallace's net edition of the Bible is not based on the Byzantium or any of these. It's based on this very limited pool of manuscripts that they are using for the basis of their textual editions and throwing everything out. So the document, the blog thing I sent you, it's written by one of their peers.
Okay.
They get along very well. I think he's going on his show, White. It says the issues whether apologists like James White or Dan Wallace are being inconsistent for practicing reasoned eclecticism and for appealing to the vast number of Greek manuscripts.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's when it comes to inconsistency. They both don't agree with each other.
No. But they're saying, and this is where Robertson he's making the point, and this is Peter Gurry's that he's taking this in. The working presumption of most eclectic scholars is that the vast bulk of New Testament manuscripts basically should be excluded as irrelevant for the primary establishment of the text. And modern eclectics perhaps acknowledge that the actual preferred witnesses for establishing the best approximation of the original New Testament text number only in the few dozens. And this is the same point I'm making. And Peter Gurry is authorized to make that statement. He's one of the top in the field, and they get along. He's saying the same thing I am against James White and Daniel Wallace. There's no ambiguity here.
Right.
They only accept these few, and they reject everything else because they're secondary in origin. And this, all these top scholars believe that. I mean, I have all their statements. I mean, I've asked personally Elijah Hickson, who's on this. They just had the SBL conference with Dan Wallace, Bart Ehrman. They were all there. And my question to him, and I can send you a screenshot of this.
But here's the thing.
It's fine, I believe you.
But here's the thing. Did you see the response to that same article you sent me?
From who? James White?
From Dan Wallace.
Yeah, I saw the response from Dan Wallace, but he doesn't use those texts are rejected.
Yeah, but here's the thing. Even the stuff that is made about Peter Gurry, where Peter Gurry is saying these things of Wallace ends up having to correct the guy on because, like, saying that he's an apologist. I'm not an apologist. I use apologetics, but I'm by no means an apologist. And he even explains the embarrassment of riches, where, according to Gurry, embarrassment of riches means, well, he's embarrassed to use some of the material that's in the riches. But in reality, he says, quote, Ehrman has argued against the phrase embarrassment of riches because of the lateness of the manuscripts that comprise most of these riches. Robinson says something similar, point 3 above, dealt with below. Ironically, the phrase is a modification of a line in a book that Bart Ehrman co-authored, page 51 of Metzger and Ehrman's text of the New Testament. We read, in contrast with these figures, which deal with the other Greco-Roman literature, the textual critic of the New Testament is embarrassed by the wealth of material, italics added. This is the same thing that Metzger had written in his previous edition. So if Ehrman claims some measure of authorship on this book, and there is no hint anywhere that the two authors disagree over any points, so far as I recall, then I am almost mimicking on the quantitative argument. This brings us to 3. There are the issues with the objections, and so he goes on with the whole thing there. But the point is that he had a disagreement with what Gurry accuses him of in the article that you sent me. So he had criticisms about it in what is being addressed. And if Wallace is criticizing the issues here, then imagine what James White would have in terms of disagreeing with certain claims that are made.
Well, he's pointing out these two, but this is what the whole school of thought believes. And this is what I'm saying.
Not every single person affirms what like, for example, there's the textual critical methodology where Q is used, but not every single textual critical scholar affirms Q being a thing. In fact, the people that affirm that Mark comes first, there are some people in the Freire theory that would reject Q but still argue Mark is first.
But the consensus of these scholars are that after the 3rd century, these churches were using a type of text that was majority different than the type of text used by the 2nd and 3rd church. So they are rejecting the ecclesiastical text for this very small portion of manuscripts as the basis for their foundation. We have the Net Bible, and that's his work itself. And the basis of that is not the Byzantium, it's not the Vulgate, it's not the Aramaic Peshitta, but these very small documents that no one knows where they come from, that don't look like the texts that were used by the churches. The Greek Orthodox Church rejects their texts, and the type of text that is represented in the 1904 patriarchal text looks very much like the Textus Receptus.
Okay, let's try this then. I'm going to bring up what I mentioned earlier from Charles E. Hill regarding the issue of that.
But he's not these guys.
He is these guys. He teaches this stuff at Reformed Theological Seminary in Florida. He is part of this.
These guys are part of the Bible publishing industry.
Not just the
So,
Bible publishing industry, because keep in mind, the same professor, or one of the professors that's in that same university, Michael J. Kruger, is the guy that is now president of one of the biggest peer review publishing articles on academics in Bible study and textual criticism, the Evangelical Theological Society. Michael J. Kruger is the president of the journal for the
but
Evangelical.
Kruger's not a New Testament textual scholar.
Yes, he is.
Well, he's not involved in the work of textual criticism.
Yes, he. Oh my goodness! I have his recent book where he covers that stuff. I have the other issues where he has mentioned
But
this
he's
stuff.
not
The New
working
Testament
on.
canon counts as a field of textual criticism.
Oh, no, no, no,
where he
no.
engages
Okay.
in that.
From the canon side, but I'm talking about the CBGM. He's not involved in any of that.
This doesn't all have to be CBGM. There's more than just textual criticism in that regard. He is a textual critic.
The canon, I don't have a problem with Kruger on. Now,
It's more than
obviously
just the canon, because in his recent book, Christianity at the Crossroads, which is a second century church history book, he goes not about just canon, because that's one chapter or one portion of a chapter. He talks about, there's the apocryphal writings, there is the variants, there's the manuscripts. He talks about all this kind of stuff that we're talking about right now.
But the debate isn't on variants. We understand that there's variants.
Right, but the issue is not. But the point I'm making here is not to say that one says variants and the other doesn't. It's the issue that he goes into more than just that, more than just canon. He's going into, as I said, the same things we are talking about, and that's the main issue, and that's the main point, and that's why the book that I cited, where Charles E. Hill was in, the general editor of that, and the person who wanted that involved in it, and the person, because he's the person involved in that work, is none other than Michael J. Kruger. He is the general editor and the guy who was responsible for getting some of these scholars to help him write the biblical theological introduction to the New Testament. So he is indeed a textual critical scholar. So,
well, yeah, and in that regard, but when I'm talking about the Bible publishing industry, so that's the Nestle Allen and the UBS, operate under these theories.
Okay.
So the foundation of those texts are not the texts that have been ecclesiastically transmitted from the church. And I posed this question directly to Dr. Wasserman and Peter Gurry, who are on these committees who work directly with the Bible publishing industries. Why aren't they using these textual tools on the ecclesiastical text? And it's because they're inferior. They don't use these. Their basis are Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, and a small group of manuscripts for these textual editions, and that all these other manuscripts are inferior.
Okay.
So the problem that happened, and there's good people in the field, don't get me wrong. So the person you were quoting, there are some people good in the field, but who controls this industry that Daniel Wallace is a part of, that James White supports and propagates these theories, is on the notion that we are rejecting the witness of the official churches for these texts of unknown. And is that okay that we're throwing away the witness from the church for documents that can't witness where they come from?
I don't necessarily think that's where you started from when you started to say this.
Well, but that's the point, and that's why I'm trying to clarify, because it's a really technical field, and there's all these theories that they have promoted to consistently say that we can't trust the ecclesiastical text. That's why they hate the King James Version so much, because it's based on the...
Yeah.
Wait, hold on a second. So, are you saying that James White would hate the King James Version?
He wrote the King James controversy. He calls them cultic.
He calls King James onlyists cultic. He doesn't say the King James is cultic.
Well, no, but it's based on inferior manuscripts, and that's why they don't use it.
But my question is not about a movement. It's about, does James White say the King James Version, just the Bible, not the movement, does he say that
It's an
is
inferior text. Yeah, he does say it's an inferior text.
right, but that wasn't my original question, and that's not what you just said. You didn't say the mere inferior. You said that they hate it.
Well, yeah. Well, if you look at the comments they look at the Textus Receptus as vile.
Where does James White say it's vile?
Well, Westcott and Hort
I
made those
said James
comments.
White, not Westcott and Hort.
Okay. The thing is, the manuscripts as the basis of the King James they reject.
Okay,
That's why they don't
hold on,
accept
hold
the
on, hold on,
scholarship.
hold on, hold on. Because here's the thing I'm noticing, and this is where it's gonna be bad if we just keep doing this. When I ask these sorts of questions, what I mostly expect is a direct answer regarding these sorts of things. So that's where I'm trying to not go into what other people are saying, because when I mentioned James White, that doesn't mean what Westcott and Hort said. I'm referring specifically where James White himself has said that the Textus Receptus is, quote, vile. Has he ever said this in a video on the dividing line? Has he said this in his book, The King James Only Controversy? Has he said this in any debates he's been a part of where he has said that it is vile? In fact, from what I've seen in his discussion with King James Onlyists, he doesn't go on and treat it as if it's some very vile thing. There's my Alex Jones impersonation for the night. I need to know where this kind of like idea comes from that James White himself, not other people, thought, but specifically
he's part of the school of thought that promotes these theories.
Just because he's part of the school of thought doesn't mean he agrees with everything. This is basic common sense in the scholarship field. There is disagreement on the Q source in the same exact school
That
of thought.
has nothing to do with this part. The theory and RC. The point I'm trying to make is this was a movement to move away from the church text. Now, this wasn't started with James White.
Mm-hmm.
This began in 1881 when they introduced a theory attacking the ecclesiastical text.
Mm-hmm.
This begins in 1881. This comes out of the German rationalism of the late 18th century. It began with Griesbach noticing that there was a different text that were being used in the earlier generations.
Mm-hmm.
And after they started looking at it, Hort introduced the theory to get textual criticism off the ecclesiastical text. And that's the point I make in the video,
Mm-hmm.
is that what these scholars are doing, wouldn't disagree. What you haven't had is James White actually respond to my video to say anything that I've said in there is wrong.
Which part? Which video? Because you've made a lot.
The most recent one.
Okay.
I mean, and you
Are
know,
you sure is it that he's not aware of it?
He is aware of it. He wrote on his blog. He wrote on his Facebook about the video.
Okay.
I talked to him on Facebook where he responded, "Oh, I'm not going to respond to a cartoon." But Peter Gurry,
and I don't blame him.
Oh well, Pete. The thing is, why can't we have an open conversation? I've asked him where we talk about the problems with his theory.
Right.
I reached out to Peter Gurry. Mm-hmm. And he was more than willing to give his comments. Yeah. And Tommy Wasserman, they're both in the field, mm-hmm. at the top of their field.
Yeah.
And James White understands what I'm saying in these arguments.
Yeah.
And my main point is that they're rejecting the church. They're throwing away the church text. Mm-hmm. And this is where the big argument is, because they're getting off the official writings of the apostles for right. texts that we don't know where they come from.
Okay, because here's the thing. Here's why, at least this is how I speculated, with why White wouldn't do this, because you're not the only one that would have come across in these kinds of conversations with him, and where he doesn't want to engage with the particular individual, is that the way you've come off. In fact, that's the thing. This was before I even met you and only first heard of you. I thought from what I got from your videos is you were saying James White is a hell-bound, unsaved heretic, and he is attacking and trying to destroy the New Testament, much like Gnostics and Bart Ehrman are trying to do.
But I never said that in my video.
Exactly, but you came off that way. And that's the issue where I said, again, is where you need to be a little more clear with some of these things because that's how White took it. That's how several people that saw the video took it. But unless you preface these things or have a different approach in handling these subjects and rewording certain things possibly, because the way you do describe and utilize it is putting James White as this villain, as this guy that needs to be going against, especially the way you treat him as the Scrooge of Christmas in the James White Ruins Christmas video.
But you do understand that James White attacked David Wood. David Wood was defending.
Where did he attack David Wood?
Yeah, now Sam Shamoon was the one that wrote to me to ask me if I can do a defense against James White. I mean, all these scholars go after. I mean, James White's not the nicest of guys. David Wood was actually.
Neither is Sam.
Huh?
Neither is Sam.
No, but Sam's a good guy.
Let me tell you my experience with him, because here's why I am banned from his channel now.
You're banned?
Yeah, because I simply said, I was addressing the issue of, what is your thoughts on James White's approach with Muslims, and he basically said something like, RC apologist, I don't know who you are, but I don't know why you made a comment like that. This issue is about about the Quran. That's what this hangout is. I don't know why you're typing this. Honestly, I think you're a troll. I think if you post another comment like that, you're banned. You don't really belong here. And then he checks out my channel, which at the time had a lot of James White videos on him responding to Adnan Rashid. And that's where he said, yeah, I can already tell by your content I don't like you. You aren't a really good guy. Honestly, don't want you on my channel.
Wow. Honestly,
now,
I
do apologize on behalf of Sam. You're a good Christian, RC. I don't. You do good work out there. There's nothing on that. Now, Sam called me to ask me to do a response because David Wood was talking about the last words of Jesus as compared to Muhammad and the last words of his friends. And so he used Father, forgive them. They know not what they do, from Jesus saying out on the cross. Now, James White instigated into the discussion that David Wood was wrong for using a scripture that's basically not original. And he sided with the Muslim because the Muslims reached out to James like, hey, David Wood, he's using scripture.
Hold on a second. Where is the evidence that he is reaching out to the Muslims? That's what I want to know right now.
No. The Muslim reached out to James White to talk about the issue.
Does that mean that he will listen to them and do that?
This was a huge issue.
Yeah, but where does it say? Because I noticed that's one of the comments that you make slightly in imagery with your video, is that you receive that James White or something is mailing, or he gets a mail from Muslim by choice.
Well, here's the thing, and there's been a lot of complaints against James White in the evangelical community, is that Muslim by choice isn't using David Wood to support his view. They use James White against statements from James White against Christians. And the Muslim by choice uses James White's argument against fellow Christians. So what happened here is James White got into the discussion and basically said David Wood was wrong for using that verse. It's a variant. It's not in the original manuscripts, and they shouldn't be using. But
James that doesn't mean that the Muslims reached out for him, and therefore that's why he commented on it. Because here's the thing: you should know, if you have looked into the whole thing between them, James White honestly thinks that Muslim by choice is a troll. Like he thinks he thinks that Muslim by choice is honestly disingenuous when using his videos, because in one video, Muslim by choice tries to say, "Thank you, James White, for your speeches and your works have helped convert thousands to Islam," and he thinks, "Really? That's what you think?" And he uses a video from Adnan Rashid that supposedly is borrowing from James White's work, and it honestly says, here's from Adnan Rashid using the argument from James White that the Trinity is disproven, even though the video shows simply a disagreement, and that in reality it is proving the Trinity. So that's where the speculations are that Muslim by Choice doesn't know what he's talking about, and that he's actually just a troll trying to start flames, just like Yahya Snow, another one who will use James White's arguments, and why James White has considered. And I even have a video on my channel where it shows James White's comments on Yahya Snow, that essentially that. And in fact, let me just simply play this for our audience, just to know this particular issue regarding Yahya Snow and James White, because those two, Yahya Snow and Muslim by Choice, are like roommates. Like they have their own podcast together.
I've seen them, and I know Muslim by Choice is a troll.
Right.
Don't get me wrong.
But let me just point this out for our audience about James White's comments on Yahya Snow regarding this. Not too long.
And right now I can tell you, Yahya Snow is going, oh, good, what do I get now? I really appreciate the fact that David Wood, Sam Shamoon both have, come out and said the same thing. I have been thinking about quite some time addressing the issue of Yahya Snow, but they've done so already, and I'll just add my voice to it. Yahya Snow exists to cause division and to end meaningful conversation between Christians and Muslims. That's his entire purpose in life. I've never seen a positive, meaningful addition to the dialogue from Yahya Snow. His videos are specifically designed to slant, to divide, to misrepresent. I've just never seen the man do anything fair in his life. I've just never seen it.
So that's from James White on Yahya Snow, and I'm pretty sure, because if you look at their videos, they're the same. That's why I used to think that Muslim by Choice and Yahya Snow were the same people.
They're different, those two.
Yeah, and that's what I eventually learned once I discovered their podcast. But the thing there is that they both use the same format. They use the same kind of thing where they say, here's a... Because even then, while they do that with James White, there's videos where Muslim by Choice or Yahya Snow attacks James White. And they'll either use, at that point, it's like in the reversal, that it's as if now we're going to use David Wood or Sam Shamoon to attack James White as being wrong.
I think in that particular case with Father Forgive Him, James White could have easily, and this is why I said in my letter to him when we were talking, is you could have easily supported that reading. Yeah, there's variants of all types out there, but this is the overwhelming majority of reading that is found everywhere. And you sided with it shouldn't be right. And he said personally on this scripture that he wouldn't preach on it, just like he wouldn't preach on the last 12 verses of Mark. And this is the message that's being put out there, is that we cannot trust. I mean, David Wood is just talking about the last words of Jesus, and we shouldn't be using those words because it's a variant and it wasn't in the original.
So let me ask you this: would you hold that level of against one guy that's becoming a scholar, Vocab Malone?
I talked personally with Vocab Malone about this issue.
Yeah.
When we were in Austin. Now the thing is, Vocab, we sat down. We've done projects together that I've been a part of.
Yep.
He's a great friend, great Christian brother.
Yeah.
And we've sat down and we talked about these issues. And he understands where I'm coming from.
But does he agree with you though?
Well, he told me this because when I told him, I said, "Vocab, you need to understand what they're exactly saying."
Okay.
They're
yes
saying,
or no, though.
He says, if they're saying what you're saying, I wouldn't agree with them, but I don't believe that's what they're saying. And this is the problem, is because if you write to, if you want to write to James White, he would agree with what I'm saying. This is what they're saying. Dan Wallace is saying it. Peter, this whole industry is based on that notion. I mean, why do you think?
So let me see if I get this straight. You're saying that in public they won't say this, but if I were to go to them in private, they would say that we must throw out the Byzantine text.
Yeah, it's secondary. It's inferior. That it's not the basis. That text is not the basis. I mean, I quoted you all these passages to use for the textual foundation.
To me, I honestly think that is again equivalent to trying to basically raise the accusation that all Muslims are doing taqiyya and all Muslims want to, in reality, think of blowing up. That's what I get when I hear you say something like that about that. In reality, this is what white wood affirmers say. Because here's the thing: unless you can have documented proof from him that this is what he.
Why don't you? I mean, why don't you ask James White?
Because I know that he's busy. I've tried messaging him or saying certain tweets. He rarely responds to my tweets whenever I send them out to him because he is so busy.
You've debated Nick Sayers before, right?
Nick Sayers?
Yeah. Can you debate him on King James?
Which one is Nick Sayers?
You guys had a debate.
That guy. Yeah, that guy. Yeah, we just simply regarded the issue on King James onlyism, which the only issue that I have is people trying to say we must go only with the King James, because there will be people that'll say, if you don't use the King James, you're not really doing good Bible study, or you're not a Christian. And there is different camps of King James onlyism. Like, for example, there's Ricky from what's the
Dallas?
From Dallas. Yeah, he's the guy that debates he's the white guy that debates the Hebrew Israelites.
Yeah, no, I know who he is. He's pretty cool.
And he's a King James onlyist, but he's a King James onlyist because I've talked to people that do know him directly. He's a King James onlyist in the sense that he believes it is the most preferred, but he won't say you're not using a good Bible if you use like the ESV, because the other guy, Chris Williams, the black guy that goes with him,
he was in my video.
Yeah, he uses the ESV when he goes along with Ricky. And so they have no problems using different versions and having different philosophies on this whole thing. But then when I hear someone like Nephilim Free, who says that if we use the ESV or the NIV or any of that, we're using a satanic Bible, I disagree with that highly, and I find that to be very much a blasphemous kind of notion, to then try to do that with accusing other people to read the Word of God, and people who need a way to understand it, rather they be people that are based off the tradition of the King James, and they're just. That's one reason why I use two versions. The King James, because I've grown up with that. It's a good classical reading, very soothing in my reading. But when I go out street preaching and witnessing to people in the streets, I use the CSB because I think that it is an accurate translation in certain areas of the English rendering from certain words. Especially John 3:16, I think, is most accurately translated in the CSB. Because everyone says, "For God so loved the world," and it puts it in an emphasis like, "Oh, He so loved it." Like, that's not in the original Greek. The original Greek text reads, "For God loved the world as so," and the translation that the CSB gives it is, "For God loved the world in this way."
Those minuscule differences
exactly
don't necessarily convey a different message than what a street preacher would try to promote to the world.
Exactly.
That really doesn't actually matter.
Exactly. And so that's where, just because there's a difference there, I wouldn't then shame the King James onlyist guy. And I'm talking to King James onlyist that's like nearly Steven Anderson level King James onlyist.
No, not even remotely.
Like, but that's the thing. I street preach with him, and he knows what I believe. He knows that I use a different translation, but we can get along and realize that, well, we aren't teaching a different gospel. We aren't teaching from a different text. He has disagreements with it, but we are witnessing to people. We are preaching to people, and we are explaining the same exact message that we are trying to get out, because that's the thing. I think personally that he's getting away from the sort of Steven Anderson kind of thing. He's still slowly in there, but I think because of the one friend of mine that I know that's with him, he is slowly getting out of that. And then because of him going out and street preaching with me on several occasions, and after hearing what I have to say, he kind of picks up on using that kind of argument and those ideas and beliefs. And so he kind of differs with what people like Steven Anderson would teach on these issues. So again, The issue is that fact that we have people that can look at these different things and can look at this with regards to the Bible or textual criticism, but they're still affirming the same essential Christian doctrines, and most of all, they aren't attacking the New Testament, and no one's accusing these people of attacking the Bible, except for some reason. People that are accused of the issues of, certain textual critical methodologies, which is why I want to see you shift away from New Testament, look into the Old Testament, and see if you can remain consistent there. Because I tried to do that with regard to from New Testament to go into Old Testament studies, and I tell you, it is really hard trying to be going to some of the usual kinds of apologetic methodologies in light of certain facts of the original Hebrew, in light of certain texts, because I could see and understand why there was the debate about these issues in JEPD theory, and then eventually later comes fragmentary and supplementary hypothesis after documentary hypothesis not only gets abandoned, but a new documentary hypothesis theory comes where now it's more than JEPD. But you have all these other different sources and all these other things, and I don't know what your thoughts are on Michael Heiser, because I know that I'm pretty sure you should be aware that Vocab Malone certainly has talked to him.
Yeah, no, and I'm not against Michael Heiser. The thing is, there's a lot of good Christians out there, and as you mentioned, with all these theories that have only come out within the last 200-300 years, these theories are coming out which undermine the reliability. It doesn't throw confidence into it. When you start talking about Moses not writing the Torah, and it's by all these different editors, and then we have all these scriptures weren't originally in the New Testament and they were added. When I went up against Carrier, it's because these theories, when we step outside our evangelical communities, this is what we are facing on our attacks to the New Testament. And when this school of thought is pushing this narrative that this corruption did occur, but we're trying to get in front of it now and correct the problems of the last 1,200 years to restore the text back to its original form, it feeds into this narrative. I mean, Richard Carrier, as a historian, he doesn't write on the last 12 verses of Mark because it doesn't mean anything. It does. It has significant meaning out there, especially when they apply it. Like Dillahunty in his debate with Mike Winger, they always go to textual criticism as a base. Oh yeah, Mark last 12 verses, 1 John 5:7,
Okay.
women and adultery, and hundreds of other passages, which doesn't preach a message that the Bible is reliable.
So let me get this straight. So does utilizing, so the fact that some of these atheists utilize textual criticism to try to disprove the reliability of the Bible, does that mean that textual criticism is therefore an attack against the Bible instead of able to be a use to help defend the reliability of the Bible?
Well, I support textual criticism. I mean, Jerome was a very well-versed textual critic. Thomas of Harkle, who did the Philoctean, excellent job. The Reformers, and we're talking about Theodore Erasmus, Cardinal Jimenez, Stephanus, Theodore Beza, and this is the point. James White is a Reformed guy,
yeah,
and he rejects the text of the Reformation.
So where does it say that he rejects text of the Reformation? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, he doesn't support the Textus Receptus at all. The text of the Reformation they reject because
Which
it's
Textus
based
Receptus?
on any one of them. Theodore Beza. Theodore Beza
you're familiar with the first and the second edition of the TR lack 1 John 5:7 in the critical notes, right?
Yeah, but it was also in It was in his third, fourth, and fifth edition. So
Yep. But
early
notice,
works.
the early works don't have it, and that's the whole issue. Is that the point is that I don't think that James White would say we must therefore reject it. He is considering that, but considering the entirety of it.
He rejects the Textus Receptus. That's
the John Ankerberg show program where they discuss that seems to indicate a totally different story.
I mean, reach out to Robert Truelove. Reach out. They reject
about James White.
Oh yeah, he rejects the Textus Receptus.
So let me get this straight. To get an idea of what James White thinks, I must go to someone else.
No, you can ask James White himself, and I will put 6 cans of the Bang on the thing that he rejects the Textus Receptus.
Okay. But I'm not going to gamble or bet on that kind of thing because again,
not bad.
I'll get you Bang anyway. Because to me, this is a serious issue, and this is where my whole problem is. That essentially, what this seems to suggest is a lot of claims made about what is the quote true intentions of these people that honestly can't be backed up by any evidence, but just mere assumptions based off of what other people who would disagree with people like Wallace and White on these matters. This is the important thing to understand, RC. I'm not his personal intentions. I think he has every intent to restore the text to its original form, and he's trying to prove with all his scholarship and research that this is the correct form of the text. I've never said that James White isn't trying to defend the reliability of the text. Of course he is. Does he believe that Bible's preserved? Of course, but what he's not saying, the thing that's being missed here is they're rejecting all these texts. They're saying that all these texts are inferior. They're secondary in order. They were put together. These are not the original. These aren't the ones that the apostles handed down. So we got to get away from these because we go over there. And actually, I think I have something from James White. They want us to start reading the TR Bibles and everything else on his Twitter comments, referring to my video. Okay.
So I can definitely send you that. But they feel, and I know James White in the bottom of his heart, he feels that he's defending the reliability of the New Testament. I don't take that away. I don't think his intentions are bad at all. I think what's happening is this school of thought, which has created kind of a dark cloud within the evangelical community, is undermining the reliability because it's infecting, just like bad theology coming into the churches, and there goes justification by faith, original sin, and all these doctrines that are falling out of the church. Mm-hmm. In the same way, this scholarship came into, it's in the seminaries, it's all over, mm-hmm. And James White James White is doing the same warning I'm doing. Don't go to the TR, the text of the Reformation, because you're not getting the original form of the New Testament. We have to go back here.
But didn't you just say that he said in the Twitter thing to reading more TR Bibles?
Don't do it. He wants all of us to start going to TR Bibles.
To start going to TR Bibles?
No, not to. That he's saying that's what we want, that we should all be reading TR Bibles. That for James White and others in the field, the thought of going to the TR, and Hort's statement was vile. It's a corruption.
White. Hort, not White.
Well, no, but it's the same feeling. This whole school of thought thinks the Textus Receptus.
Just because one person says one thing doesn't mean everyone automatically agrees with that. Just like one person in the same source criticism.
No, this is the whole consent.
Well, there's people that say this
is the whole point. I mean, when James says about the Byzantium text, the Byzantium represents a later period in which readings from this is what the TR is based on the Byzantium text form. That's with some Western readings. So this is, so when he said most people believe the Byzantines represents a later period in which readings from other text types were put together, conflated into the Byzantine reading. Since the Byzantine comes from a later period, the earliest texts are almost all Alexandrian and not Byzantium. So by us going to those texts, we're further away from the original text. That's why they reject those. That's why Dan Wallace says, they are secondary. They're inferior. That's why they're not used, because, if you think about it, from James White, Daniel White, this is the central issue. This is what Hort brought up at the very beginning in 1881, and this has been the consensus scholarship. That's why Bruce Metzger comes out with the book, the text of the New Testament, its transmission, its corruption, and restoration. That restoration is restoring it back to the original form.
Okay.
That's why, the TR is completed. Yeah, can it be polished up? Of course. There's no issue on that. If James White wanted to make some, textual corrections on the King James, we're not fighting about that at all. There's nothing wrong with textual criticism. Now, in 1881, everything changed because they got off the official text of the church. The Greek church doesn't use the text they use, and the official Greek churches do not use the text that they use, and basically called them out in 1904. But James is saying, and he's arguing from his heart, that if you're using these texts, you are further away from the original text. That's why he won't.
Where does he say that?
Well, in his statement right here, this is what this means.
Where's
the
the statement
Byzantine
from?
text represents a later period. The TR is based on that text. That's the primary form of the TR.
Just because it's later doesn't mean that therefore he is saying that it is deviating from it. I quoted the other
He says
pages.
The earliest texts are almost all Alexandrian and not Byzantium.
And he's also stated that both the Byzantine or the Antioch as well as the Alexandrian are both where the preservation of the Word of God relies on. So that's one issue where he says that, and also elsewhere where he has noted we shouldn't just merely reject where just these Byzantine things.
And I get where you're going, and I'm telling you, I'll share all these articles. I could definitely find quotes from James White. This is the position. You can write to James White yourself and ask him about the TR text. Why doesn't he preach on those scriptures? Those scriptures are found in Byzantium text form.
Everyone's going to have their own reasons for not preaching, and not just simply those things. Like, there's people that are demanding that we must preach from certain Old Testament verses. And they say that if we don't want to preach on those, that means, oh, you don't think it's scripture then. Like, I've met people that literally had this mindset and thought that I must preach from the story where the 42 people were mauled by bears. If I don't preach on that for any sort of reason, I must be denying that it's scripture, or that I don't think it's from God or something like that. And I don't agree with that line of reasoning. I think it is much like this thing, a sort of non sequitur to it. The reason why James White probably has his own reasons for not preaching that, because there's other people I know that would preach from certain texts that they would think that is therefore not scripture, but they would still preach on it regardless. There's even the What video, the WWUTT channel, that did a big defense of the pericope adulterae passage. While saying it's not authentic, they still basically gave a preaching and exegetical defense of what is usually meant by that in regards to objections made by skeptics. So they do have a preaching of it, even with scriptures that they don't view
that are not original to the New Testament.
Say what?
Should we be using passages that are not original to the New Testament. So if
I
something
don't think
doesn't
I don't think
belong
there's a
in there,
problem with utilizing that. And again, this is where I will probably be in disagreement with some people, and other scholars will be on my side too on this, and we'll have a disagreement with other scholars. So again, this is why we must consider not everyone thinks the same exact way, and we have to keep that in mind. Otherwise, we are going to make a lot of very foolish statements that come to bite us in the end.
these are coming from their top experts. That's why I said when they say that the Byzantium text form, the Byzantium have been disparaged by the majority of New Testament textual critics
Okay.
as the least valuable for recovering the original text. That's why they don't use it. There's no value.
Some people, and
No, this is
right,
Peter Curry
but
from his book.
and I could care less about him. I'm
Yeah,
talking.
but
The point
but
is
James
the
White
point.
supports what he's doing, and
I'm
he's
pretty sure
part
he
of the
doesn't
same
support every
school of
single
thought.
individual thing, as we can see from Daniel Wallace doesn't support every individual thing.
He says the same statement. That's the thing. Daniel Wallace makes the same statement about it.
About what?
So that's why I'm saying, and I'm just saying this as a fellow brother in Christ. It's important to understand what they're really saying. And I know it's hard to believe. I sat down with Voca. He's like, man, if they said that, I wouldn't believe it. But that's what they're saying. And if
Then
you
have to
write
provide
to these
documentation.
scholars, if you write to James White, he wouldn't deny that. He doesn't support the text of the Reformation because he felt like they didn't have the resources that they needed. So while he doesn't want to openly attack, he's like, well, they didn't have the resources we have, and that's why they went with this bad text. So this is the thing you got to understand. They look at that text type, which is the basis for the TR, as the least valuable. So what's represented in the TR is so far removed from the original text. And this is why the King James only movement, comes about, because those groups don't want to come off that text because of the fact that all these new editions are changing. I mean, they have 28 editions of the Nestle Allen, which is supposed to represent the original form of the text. And after 29 editions, they're still going to keep going. And when I asked Peter Gurry, well, when are you guys ever going to get a stable text? He said, this is going to go on forever.
Okay.
So with the CBGM as the basis for all basically the two major publishing industries, and the Tyndale House is also part of it as well, the text will always be changing. We don't have a stable text like we had in the Reformation that had come down the last 300 years. The text will always be changing. And is that the fruit is that the fruit of the Spirit right there? I mean, is this what the Bible is saying is the preserved word of God? It's being changed all the time by two major Bible industries that come up with different readings that are being promoted and pushed out to the public. And the Roman Catholic Church has jumped on this initiative with the UBS. So now they are very involved, and it started with the Jerusalem Bible to get involved in this, where now they have a firsthand part of these changing texts. Mm-hmm. And this is what's happening. Every new edition coming out, they're changing. It's a new form of the text. With every discovery they make of some scrap that they find, they're changing and they're updating the text, and we don't have a stable text anymore. And the purpose of my argument is against this, because this is what's happening. I mean, this is bigger than James White, even though he's just one voice. Mm-hmm. The industry controls all this stuff.
Right.
And this is what I'm trying to fight against.
And there's the thing. Because my main issue is not about, again, the industry. And
but what my issue is. James is a voice. James is one voice.
One voice that disagrees with part of what that industry says. He has made videos going after what some of these people have said. I have seen this on his dividing line.
He promoted Tommy Wasserman and Peter Gurry's book on his show, A New Approach to Textual Criticism. He said, "Hey guys,
he's also promoted the study Quran on his channel. Does that mean he is therefore promoting that we should be Muslims or something?"
No. He supports this book and he's reading it,
And he's read the study Quran and promoted it.
No. He supports the work that Curry is doing on, and this is what I want you to understand. It's not only Gurry, but White, it's Wallace, it's everyone in this field. This is the direction that they're going in. He uses the NA and the UBS, so that's what I'm saying. It's not James White is just a small pawn in this industry that's promoting this type of scholarship, and that's why. You could look into this personally yourself. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. I've been wrong about 1,000 things. But what I'm just telling you as a Christian brother, this is what's happening behind the scenes. And a lot of Christians are trying to understand why in Bible study, people bring 5 different Bibles and scriptures come out with different translations, different meanings. Some scriptures are not in there, but they're in other Bibles. And not only do we don't have a stable text, but we have a lot of confusion out there. Okay. And this is why groups like the King James are like, you know what? Whatever issues or translation issues or problems there may be, this is going to be a stable text and it's not going to change. And I'm going to go with it. So they take a very strong position on not changing, because what's happening is every year, these texts are changing, new editions are being created. That's the whole concept of the textual Frankenstein. Mm-hmm. And James White is a supporter of the CBGM. He's advocated on his show. Mm-hmm. He says this is the way it needs to be going. I could definitely find the videos and send it to you. He's not just promoting it to promote it. Mm-hmm. He says this is the way of new textual criticism. He said the old methods were wrong that they were using, because with the CBGM, it falsified a number of their theories, and this is the way to go. Honestly, and I'm just talking about between two brothers, this idea that the text is constantly changing, scriptures are removed from some, added to others. Is this part of God's plan, in the sense that is this biblical? Is this the preservation of the text that we're talking about?
I would say that in terms of what is actually meant by changing, that would depend on where it would be defined in there, because people have different understandings of that, as well as the word corruption. I define corruption much like other scholars define it, where it just simply means a change. So in other words, if you have apple, and then you have another text copy that says apple but is missing a P, that is by definition a corruption. It is simply just the fact that hang on. It is simply the fact that there is some sort of change, whether intentional or non-intentional, into the text. But that's just my position on that. Hang on. Hang on. Ave, do you have anything you would like to? Because I know you've been silent a bit, and I thank you for your patience in regards to that. Ave, you there?
Did he leave?
No, he's here. It's just I don't know. I'm gonna have to buzz him.
And I only have like 6 more minutes before my wife kicks my butt.
Why say that?
Oh, because she's signaling for me to get off the computer.
All right. Well, then we'll just wrap this up here then, because we have gone at it for quite a bit.
No, but it's good, and my whole thing is, I want Christians to understand what's really being said and what's really happening out there. There's a lot of stuff that seems like it's cloak and dagger, but this is an issue affecting the church. There's a lot of concern about this, and this is why a lot of people are moving back either to the King James or the TR editions, because the texts are changing, and this industry is promoted to do so. It's going to constantly change. Mm-hmm. And is this what we should be supporting as Christians?
Mm-hmm. Right. So, you said your piece there, and we're gonna just since like you mentioned, there's your wife, and I gotta figure out if Ave is AFK or if he's MIA, and hopefully not KIA. That would be the one thing we don't want from our candy corn doggo. He is the wonderful mascot that keeps this whole thing together. So that's where I'm kind of worried if he either fell asleep or if he's decided to go and get something.
And also, if you ever need any artwork or anything, please let me know so I can help you in your ministry.
Well, that's the one thing, actually, funny enough. Me and Abe were looking for a banner to replace the... because I don't know if you're seeing like the YouTube live thing. But
yes.
that's normally the banner that we use for the thing. And I have been thinking of getting with this one furry artist to write a banner to replace it, where it shows me and Abe sitting at a table, kind of like in a studio kind of desk thing with our mics and everything, and I'm just chilling and talking all casually, and he's like howling or whatnot. So that kind of a
yeah, I could draw that up pretty easily. That shouldn't be hard. I did some of Vocab's banner work for him on his channel.
Did you do the because I noticed there was something, but it didn't kind of look like it. Did you do the opening to his show, or is that a different person?
Yeah, that's fine. We went through a couple of different, because first he was not street apologist. It was Backpack Radio.
Yeah, Backpack.
And then he got a cease and desist letter from someone, so we had to change it. But yeah, I did that opening. So obviously, if you want an opening or something for your show, we could do something pretty cool.
Okay. All right. So I'm gonna have to work on an opening, if that's the case, because that's the thing. I don't know how to work video yet. I'm gonna have to do a test on that in the future to see if I can do that.
Well,
I'm still trying to be new. I'm still new to OBS, which is the studio I use for this.
Okay.
But a picture at least would be good enough to help out there. But anyways, like I said, we're gonna try to wrap this up quickly, so I'm going to go ahead and play the usual outro music. You won't be able to hear it, but our audience, our lovely audience that is listening, will be hearing this. So thank you, Jonathan, for coming on. And I don't know if he's there, but I want to thank Ave for also likewise taking the time to come on and help us out. So this has been a good conversation, and I hope that y'all have gotten a benefit out of it as much as I say that about our guest on here, that he has also likewise helped provide something for every one of y'all to think about. So that being said, just want to keep in mind for everybody, and by the way, Jonathan, if you could mute your mic, because I'm going to make sure that the whole music plays out during this thing. And like I said, the background noise can be picked up of what's on the thing here. But anyways, like I just want to keep in mind for all of y'all that are listening, go and examine the evidence regardless of who is making these things, whether it be the Ehrman guys or whether it be White and Wallace. The whole point, I think, of the whole thing in textual criticism or any sort of study in the world of biblical studies is to examine the evidence from all perspectives, and then ultimately, based off of the data, the use of primary resources, and all these things, make your own conclusions. And that's why that should be what should encourage us to go study the Bible and search deeper for God's truth and for the meaning of His Word and for what exactly His Word is. So we all have differences, but I recommend and encourage everyone to do their research. But until then, this has been RC Apologist. Gonna let the music play out. But until then, y'all take care.
Okay. Did you turn it off?